I am Jamie Deaton with the National Center for Education Statistics, and we're joined today to talk about insights on American Indian and Alaska Native students from the National Indian Education Study, A Closer Look report. As many of you know, the National Center for Education Statistics has recently released this report. It was released last month, and National Indian Education Study, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll refer to as NIES. So joining us here today to discuss the findings from that report is Dr. Peggy Carr, Associate Commissioner of the Assessments Division at the National Center for Education Statistics, as well as Dr. Susan Faircloth, NIS Technical Review Panel Chair and Professor and Director of Colorado State University's School of Education. Just a quick housekeeping note before we get started. There will be a question and answer session at the conclusion of the presentation. As Emily mentioned, you may want to submit questions for our presenters at any time by using the chat function on WebEx, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. We're also recording the webinar, so you can pass that along to your colleagues who aren't able to join us today. Now I will turn it over to Dr. Carr.
And thank you again, Dr. Deaton. And welcome to everyone who's joined us today. And we are discussing the recently released NIES, National Indian Education Study, the report entitled A Closer Look, an in-depth follow-up report on the 2015 National Indian Education Study. NIES is administered in conjunction with the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known to many of us as NAEP. There are two main components to the study. The first being the NAEP mathematics and reading assessments at grades 4 and 8, and the second, an NIES-specific survey given to students, their teachers, and school administrators. We want to ensure that the study and its reports are driven and informed by American Indian Alaska Native stakeholders. This includes the Office of Indian Education, who provides the funding for the report, the Bureau of Indian Education, or BIE, and the White House Initiative on American Indian Alaska Native Education. It also includes members of our technical review panel, and is comprised of NIAIN educational leaders across the country. And I want to mention our NIES support service contractors as well. I've listed both the Tribal Tech, and this is the current NIES contractor, and also it includes Kaufman and Associates, as they were the contractor at the time of the 2015 data collection. Before diving into the Closer Look report, I'd like to discuss some of the overall trends we've seen in AIAN student achievement. Over time, there have been persistent score gaps between AIAN and non-AIAN students for both grades 4 and grade 8 in reading. As you see here, when you take a closer look, there are asterisks, and they are seen here on the screen, and they denote a particular score that is statistically different from the 2015. While there were statistically significant increases between 2005 and 2015 for the non-AIAN student group, the average scores for AIAN students were not statistically different, with the exception of one grade 8 reading in 2007. You should also note that some of the gap figures that you see here, well, they will not add up exactly, and that's because this is rounding, and that would account for the differences that you might detect. You can see similar gaps here for mathematics for grades 4 and 8. For grade 8 math in 2011, the asterisk indicates that the gap between AIAN and non-AIAN students had significantly decreased in 2015 as compared to 2011. Beyond student achievement, the first NIES 2015 report focuses primarily on two themes. To what extent are culture and language part of a curriculum? To what extent are school resources available for improving student achievement? In 2015, more than 16,000 students across grades 4 and 8 participated in this study. We're able to break down the results into three mutually exclusive school categories. They include rural Indian education, BIE schools, low-density public schools, and high-density public schools. Here we see AIAN score trends for math among the different school types compared to the average AIAN score trends. It's worth clarifying that on the grade 8 graph, the score for BIE students from 2007 to 2009 are statistically lower compared to their 2015 scores, but their scores from 2005 do not have the same level of statistical significance. This is because the 2005 sample only included approximately 1/4 of BIE schools. But starting in 2007, all BIE schools serving grades 4 and or 8 have been included in the sample, and we certainly are appreciative of that. With grades 4 BIE schools, we did not meet the 70% participation rate in 2015. That's also shown here in this graph. You can see noticeably that that data point is missing. So here we see the same breakdown for AIAN score trends, but for reading. Similar to math, scores mainly held steady, just a few exceptions as shown here. Again, you'll notice that there are no reportable data for grade 4 reading for BIE schools in 2015, and this is again because of the 70% requirement for participation. It was not met. Now let's get into the new report. And this takes us into a deeper dive with these data, and they were not included in that first report. The closer look report examines contextual factors that are associated with higher and lower performing AIAN students, and how AIAN students see themselves in terms of their native language, culture, and aspirations for the future. These factors help us better understand the idea of diversity of student groups and their performance on NAEP, students group being AIAN student groups. So first, let's take a look at factors associated with higher and lower performing AIAN students. For the purpose of this report, we are defining higher performing students as those whose scale scores are at or above the 75th percentile, and lower performing students are those whose scores are at or below the 25th percentile. Within this section of my presentation here, we'll be looking at access to resources, attendance, reading activities, and how students view their mathematical ability. By that I mean mathematical self-efficacy. I also would like to provide an important side note for interpreting the results that we're going to be discussing today. A relationship between a variable and a measure of student achievement, education achievement, like the ones presented in this report, does not imply that a variable causes differences in educational achievement. The opposite could be true. For example, achievement could lead to certain levels of self-efficacy. On this slide, I'd like to show you the differences between higher and lower performing students in terms of the percentage of each student group who reported having access to certain resources at home and at school. So let's take a look at grade 4 results first. Across math and reading, a significantly higher percentage of higher performing AIAN students reported having access to different types of resources than lower performing AIAN students. Looking at grade 8 data, you can see that there is a very similar pattern. When you look at attendance and reading activities, we also see some differences between higher and lower performing students. A higher percentage of higher performing AIAN students reported both having perfect attendance and reading more than 20 pages for school and homework each day than their lower performing peers in both reading and math. While the differences in the percentages at grade 8 are not statistically different, they do suggest a pattern that we find interesting and might be expected. On this slide, we focus on survey items about reading. Teachers who provide time daily for students to read books on their own and choosing them as they like, and students who get to read a book on their own choosing. Again, we see significant differences across the higher and lower performing group of AIAN students for both questions at grade 4. At grade 8, we do not see a significant difference for this question at the top. The cross symbol under the second question indicates that this item was not included on the grade 8 questionnaire, so all questions were not asked of all students. For mathematics self-efficacy, we see differences across the higher and lower performing groups. This is true for grade 4 students feeling like they can do a good job on mathematics assignments, and for grade 8 students who report always understanding what mathematics teachers ask of them. We do note that the top question was only included for grade 4 students, and the bottom question was only included in the survey for grade 8 students. I also like to shift now to showing results from showing results on individual survey questions to showing results for composite variables. Composite variables are combined results across 3 or more conceptually related NIES survey questions. What we're going to cover in this section includes 3 major themes: interest in reading about cultures, exposure to native languages, and cultural knowledge. There are other composite variables that I will not be covering today, but they are in the report, and I invite you and encourage you to take a look at them at your leisure. The first composite I'll be reviewing is interest in reading about cultures, which is comprised of the following questions. When my teacher talks about American Indian or Alaskan Native stories or culture, I try to read more about it. I enjoy reading about American Indian or Alaskan Native people. And I enjoy reading about people who have different traditions and cultures, ways of life, customs than I have. Across all school density categories, the percentages of AIAN students who indicated that the survey statement described a person as a lot like them range from 23 to 25% at grade 4 and from 26 to 33% at grade 8. Most AIAN students who responded to the survey question in this composite responded a little like me. instead of either of the extremes, not like me or a lot like me, regardless of their grade or their type of school they attended. With this composite, you'll also see a lot of similarities across the school types and how AIAN students responded. But there were no significant differences in any of these patterns shown here. When there are asterisks in the report, but we don't show them in these tables that indicate that some of these patterns are significantly different. But I'll make note of that as I go through them and share them with you today. The next composite variable, exposure to native languages, is composed of 3 survey questions that ask AIAN students how often they are exposed to the AI or AN language via members of their family, people in their school talking to one another, and their attendance in classes in their school taught in their native language. On average, about 1/2 of all AIAN students reported never being exposed to their native languages. Now, within this context, though, students in schools with larger proportions of AIAN students were more likely to be exposed to native languages than were their peers in schools with smaller proportions of AIAN students. At both grades, students attending BIE schools were more likely to indicate being exposed to their native languages, quote, sometimes or often, unquote, compared to their peers attending low-density or high-density public schools. The final composite variable I'll be sharing, cultural knowledge, is made up of 3 survey questions. Grade 8 AIAN students were asked how much they knew about their AI or AN history, their AI or AN traditions and culture, and current issues important to AI or AN people. About 40% of all AIAN 8th graders reported having some, quote unquote, cultural knowledge, and 13% reported that they knew nothing, quote unquote, of their culture or current issues. Cultural knowledge was more prevalent at schools with higher percentages of AIAN students in their populations. 8th grade students attending BIE schools were more likely to indicate having some or a lot of cultural knowledge compared to their peers attending low-density or high-density public schools. So mostly explored in this report are just descriptive data, sharing relationships among the various categories within a variable. So not a lot of in-depth exploration was shared in this report. But there is a NAEP Data Explorer that allows researchers such as yourselves and those who are interested in answering other questions other than the ones explored here available to you in the NDE. So, for example, in this graph that I'm going to show you here, you see there is a clear pattern that students who have more books or report having more books in the home score better. And this is regardless of the type of school they find themselves in, whether it's high density or low density or BIE schools. Such that even students who typically score lower, just on average, amongst this AIAN group, score better if they have a report of 100 or more or 26 or more books in the home in that fashion. So it's an interesting pattern that could be explored with more sophisticated analysis than we have in this report. I invite you to do just that. I think this concludes my brief summary, Dr. Deaton, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Carr. And now we will hear from Dr. Susan Faircloth, the NIES Technical Review Panel Chair.
Thank you. So good afternoon. Again, my name is Susan Faircloth. I am Chair of the Technical Review Panel for the National Indian Education Study. I am also a tribally enrolled member. My tribe is Kahari. It's a small tribe on the east coast of North Carolina. And I also serve as a professor and director of the School of Education at Colorado State University. So I am really excited about this opportunity to participate in this rollout of the 2015 NIES report, understanding the context of these data. And the next slide, if you would advance that. I'd like to just give a thank you to the members of the Technical Review Panel. And as Dr. Carr has indicated, this panel is comprised of educators, researchers, and community members with experience in the education of American Indian and Alaska Native children and youth. And this panel is also very instrumental in informing the design, the implementation, and analysis of data from the National Indian Education Study. And I think it's really important to give a special thank you to the members of this technical review panel, particularly given the fact that their primary roles are as educators, researchers, community and tribal members, parents and family members. So they are volunteering and dedicating quite a bit of their time to the conduct and implementation of this study. And the study would not be possible without their cultural knowledge, professional knowledge and wisdom that they bring to this study. I'd also like to give another thank you to all of the partners on this study. During my tenure as the chair of the Technical Review Panel, I've been continuously impressed by ETS and NCES in particular, impressed and thankful for their willingness and ability to engage the members of the TRP in the design and implementation of this study. And I think this is particularly evident in the Setting the Context document, which we'll talk about briefly today. So if you would advance to slide 37. I'd also like to acknowledge that as the technical review panel for this study, that we think it's really important to recognize and honor the federal government's trust responsibility for the education of American Indian and Alaska Native children and youth. That's a critically important aspect of the education of our children. But we also believe that it's critically and equally important to recognize and respect the role of indigenous languages and cultures in helping to create and sustain nurturing learning environments for our children and youth. And I say this not only as an educator and as a researcher, but also as the parent of a third grade American Indian student, and understanding the role that language and culture plays in her education, and also being critically aware of the extent to which native languages and cultures are oftentimes absent within the educational context in which she enters every day. And if you would advance to slide 38. So I'll make my comments very brief given the time, and we want to make sure that we have time for our audience members to engage with questions. So I'd like to point you all to a web link. It's the first bullet point on slide 38. The technical review panel had the opportunity for this version of the National Indian Ed Study to work with NCES and ETS to draft a separate but complementary document that accompanies the NIES report. And this document is called Setting the Context. It's important for us to talk just a little bit about the impetus for this document. And as members of the technical review panel, one of the things that we've been saying, I've been on the technical review panel as a member since the initial NIES study was conducted back in the early 2000s. But throughout my tenure on the technical review panel, I and other members of the review panel have consistently recognized that there are a number of contextual variables that are either absent or missing from the National Indian Ed Study and from the NAEP that help to explain many of the findings within this report. And we also recognize that including many of these contextual variables within the design of the study is not feasible at this time. However, we recognize the importance of being able to talk about and to help to set the context for unpacking and understanding the data that are presented in the NIES. And so we recognize that there are a number of potentially critical contextual variables that are not assessed in the current NIES and or reported in NAEP or in the NIES studies. And so what did we hope to achieve by developing this document? We really wanted to reiterate the importance of context and helping to understand and make sense of those data that are being collected and reporting, and make sense in terms of understanding the educational conditions that Native children and youth encounter each day, and in helping us to understand their academic outcomes in both public and Bureau of Indian Education operated or funded schools. And so I would encourage all of you, when you have some time, to go to that link that we've listed in bullet point 1 and take some time to go over and read and think through the information that we've presented in that Setting the Context document. If you would advance to slide 39. On slide 39, we've indicated just a sampling of some of the contextual factors that we feel are important in understanding and making sense of both the NAEP and the NIES as it relates to American Indian and Alaska Native students. And so first of all, we think it's really important to recognize the historical factors that impact the education of Native children and youth. And first of all is that federal trust responsibility for the education of Native students. It's also important to understand the relationship between Native parents, families, communities, and schools, and how that ultimately impacts the educational environment and academic outcomes for our students. It's equally important to recognize the diversity of Native languages and cultures, and we know that there are more than 200 different Native languages spoken to some extent across the nation, and we also know that there are more than 565 federally recognized and more than 100 state-recognized tribes across the nation, each with their own cultures and many with their own languages still intact. And that diversity of languages and cultures is important to understand and in making sense of data collected through the NIES. We also believe that it's important to understand how we recruit, how we hire, and how we retain Native teachers and school leaders. Because ultimately these individuals impact the education of our students, and many of these individuals are also answering questions that are reported on in the NIES. We also believe that it's important to understand quality of instruction, and for some of the questions that we ask, we're asking about instruction, but we're not necessarily able to delve into the quality of instruction. We also believe that it's important to recognize the education of our students requires real and meaningful tribal consultation, and that is something that we're not able to or currently able to measure or accurately assess within the NIES. And then finally, Dr. Carr has mentioned this earlier, we recognize that there are certain limitations within the data that is available within the NIES, and so we really urge readers to exercise caution as you review the data that's presented and as you try to make sense of it, and to recognize that one of the limitations is our ability to be able to suggest any causation in the variables that are reported on. If you would advance to slide 40. I'd like to conclude before I ask a couple of questions to the group is by saying that we, the members of the technical review panel, are fully committed to affecting or to working to affect positive change for American Indian and Alaska Native students and the schools and staff who serve them. And I would add, affecting positive change for those communities and tribes that those students represent. And we honor and we thank all of you who join us in this work on behalf of Native youth across this nation. We understand the importance of this work and the importance of ensuring high-quality education for our Native youth, and we understand that without that high-quality education that recognizes our languages and our cultures, as well as our academic abilities, that the futures of our communities and our tribes are at risk. And so this is critically important work. And then my final charge to this group is on slide 41. And we posed, as members of the TRP, we posed 2 questions to our audience today, as well as anyone else reading the NIES and the Setting the Context document. We asked, how might you use these data in working with American Indian and Alaska Native children and youth and their parents, families, tribes, and communities? And I should also add working with schools as well. And our second question is, what variables are important to include in future iterations of the National Indian Ed Study, and why? And I pose that question, or we as the TRP pose that question, because each year we have the opportunity to come together as a technical review panel to review the findings and as well as to provide input on the design of subsequent studies. And so input and feedback from the field is critically important in ensuring that we have the best designed study possible. So thank you again for joining us today, and I hope that each of you will read the NIES as well as the Setting the Context document. And I will turn this back over to Jamie, I think, who's facilitating the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faircloth, and we'll leave the last slide up too. So want to begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, you may submit your questions by opening up the chat tool located at the bottom of your screen. All right, and I see we already have a question, and that is NIEA, which is National Indian Education Association, NAEP, and or NIES willing to support initiatives to apply for charter schools to provide effective education for Indigenous students? If so, what is the process? We are trying to apply for an Indigenous charter school in Lumbee County. We have documented students belonging to differing 34 Indigenous nations or tribes. We went before the Office of Charter School at DPI, but there is no American Indian representation. Will one or any of the organizations support this initiative if we send it a synopsis of our proposal? We're using SCOS, STREAM, College and Career Readiness Standards, and RED Pedagogy Place-Based Curriculum.
Well, I applaud you. I am from North Carolina, so I know the county very well in that area, and I can imagine that there is a need for such educational services there. But NAEP cannot support or recommend such an application. I would suggest that you maybe call the Office of Charter Schools here in the department, and perhaps they can give you some recommendation. I know that North Carolina has a charter school board, I think. That would be another place where you might want to go to get some advice. But good luck, and it sounds like a worthy cause.
I see we also have a comment on ideas for additional variables, student mobility and access to healthcare providers. I also wanted to comment too, in addition to the NIES survey questionnaire that American Indians students take, we also have the Maine NAEP questionnaire. So that is another opportunity for future development in issues such as student mobility. All right, and we have another discussion question. One of the issues pertinent to setting the context is the quality of instruction. How can we do a better job of gathering data related to the Indian education of the teachers who are teaching Native students? And Dr. Faircloth, I want to turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Jamie. So I may not be able to answer this question.
Sure.
I think I think this is a great question. So I'll read it again. How can we do a better job of gathering data related to the Indian education of the teachers who are teaching Native students? I mean, I think that's a question that we, as the TRP, would need to talk with NCES about. Is it possible to add a supplemental question that would get at the quality of education that our teachers are receiving? I think that's what the participant is asking. Is how our teachers are being prepared to teach our students. And so I think, one of the questions that we've encountered each time try to either add or change a question to the NIES is this issue of trying to maintain trend data. And so I think we also, and Jamie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things that we've discussed is the amount of time and effort that we're requiring for participants who are completing the questionnaires. And so if we change a question, we run into the potential of losing trend. If we add a question, it may mean that we have to delete another question. Is that correct, Jamie?
Yes, that is correct. And we're really cognizant of burden overall, especially on our NIES Grade 4 questionnaire, because those teachers will complete the NAEP questionnaire. They will complete both the mathematics and reading subject-specific questionnaires before they do the NIS questionnaire as well. So that is not to say that we don't want to entertain new questions or revised questions, but we do want to be mindful of all that.
So I want to respond to, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think another thing that we could think about in the future is, the Office of Indian Education is also a partner in this work, and thinking about, are there ways in which either within or beyond the NIES to work with the Office of Indian Education to either through some of their professional development grants or through some of their title, Indian education programs, is to begin requiring the collection of some of this data around the preparation of our teachers and around the particular Indian Ed content that's being delivered. And so I think there's some of these data that could be collected either in tandem with the NIES or could be collected through the work of the Office of Indian Ed.
So I guess my point, Susan, is very similar to what you're suggesting. There is another data collection. It's not under my division, but it's in my neighboring division. It used to be called SAS, Student and Staffing, but I think now it's called the NTPS, National Teachers and Principal Survey. And we do collect information on the race, ethnicity of the teacher. Although we don't have it linked to the race and ethnicity of the student, we have it linked to the proportional representation of race, ethnicity of the school where the teacher is located. So there is some data there. It may not be as rich, I think, as the person is asking for, the person who asked the question, but it may be an opportunity for some oversampling there. So maybe we could have a conversation moving forward about how would we oversample for places where these teachers are likely to be. So that's an opportunity, I think, for possible data collections in the future. And Jamie, I think we were having a sidebar about what's in NAEP.
Sure, and I wanted to mention on the NAEP teacher questionnaire, we also ask those their race ethnicity as well. as we showed in the data earlier, one of the variables or subgroups was low-density public schools, and a large amount of our sample does come from the low-density public schools, and we want to be mindful of that, where they might be one or the only American Indian or Alaska Native compared to their classroom peers. So as we saw from the data, there's some pretty profound differences depending on the variable that we're assessing too.
And Jamie,
oh, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say I also see some other questions coming in there too that may be related to that. I think, you know, one of the things also to remember is that, you know, you've talked about there's the NAEP Data Explorer, and there's opportunities for individuals beyond the technical review panel or beyond those working on the NIES to be able to explore some of these variables in more depth beyond, you know, what's reported in the NIES. And so I think that's a really important place to look as well. And then I also think that there are, you know, there are opportunities to think about, Dr. Carr had mentioned the schools and staffing survey and the extent to which Bureau of Indian Education and tribally operated schools, the data about their schools and about their staff, the extent to which those data are included in current iterations of the schools and staffing survey. That's something that we've talked about in the past that needs to be revisited. And then the last point that I would ask Jamie is, I don't know if we explained to the audience what high and low density means, and you've referenced that a couple of times, so it might be helpful just before we move to the next question, just to remind our audience members what high and low density mean.
Sure, I would be glad to. And these density levels, just for a little bit of historical context, were set at the outset of the study before it began in 2005. And low-density public schools are those in which less than 25% are American Indian Alaska Native students. High-density public schools are 25% or more American Indian Alaska Native students. And these are mutually exclusive categories, meaning high-density public schools is different than the separate category BIE schools, which of course have far more than 25% American Indian Alaska Native students. And in setting these levels, what this has done roughly is we have two sample sizes of pretty equivalent size of low-density and high-density public schools. I see we do have multiple other questions and comments coming in, so did want to take a little bit of time to get to those as well. One is the NAEP results and NIES self-reported perceptions are disconnected from one another. Example, math and reading are not taught in native languages. We know this. The higher performing students' results are predictable, attendance, more books in the home, etc., but unrelated to language and culture. It is too easy to read the NIS report, particularly as a non-native administrator, and see no added value or detracted value in language and culture. Is there a way to make the sampled states and lack of causation more clear? And I welcome either Dr. Carr or Dr. Faircloth or both to respond to this.
Yeah, you know, this is one of our, you know, pet peeves. We really try very hard not to lead people down the path that X leads to Y or Y leads to X because it could be either way, and there could be many other variables that enter into play. You know, with more sophisticated analysis, LISRA analysis, HLM analysis, you can get closer to some causation, but not in the reports that we put out. We do have a technical notes that we release with the report, and we make this, we hope, explicitly clear, but its clarification is always something that we strive to improve.
And Dr. Faircloth, I welcome your comments too, if there's anything you'd like to add.
No, I would just say, I mean, I think that the question about, you know, causality, I mean, that's one of the points that, you know, we reiterated a couple of times in this discussion today, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have that context document, was to reiterate that a third time. I think that, you know, one of the things I would ask from NCES and ETS is, you know, the opportunity to continue, to the extent possible, producing these context documents, because I think that that's a place where we can help to reiterate the importance of the study, but also the limitations. And I think it sometimes is too simple to see data and assume causality, but I think that's the place where we as members of the technical review panel can help to point out that we're not suggesting causality. And I think the other part was about explaining sampled states. And that's a question that comes to me quite often is, well, how do the states that are included in the NIES, how do they get included? And I think that that's something that we as members of the TRP and individuals working with NCES and ETS can probably do a better job of trying to explain to stakeholders why we've limited the collection of data for the NIES or the reporting of data in the NIES to these particular states. And I don't know,
Sure.
Peggy or Jimmy, if that's something you want to just talk about briefly now.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. This is something that clearly we've put a lot of technical rigor into. Jamie knows it best, and he can respond to it.
And I'm happy to. And the first report with 2015, for 2015, NIS spotlighted those states that were included. I did want to point out that we do sample students from across the country, and to do a national level sample, it is critical to include all states, even those that we can't meet our reporting standards. And to have a subgroup reporting such as a state, we need at least 62 students across 5 schools. So when considering which states can be included, we do so before every administration, recognizing that there's some population shifts over time. There are certain states like Oklahoma, Alaska, New Mexico, North Dakota, South Dakota, where we don't need any oversampling to get at AN state-specific data. The general rule of thumb is if a state has 1% or more students that are American Indian Alaska Native, we're able to get at it through oversampling. Going back to the point of always looking at it before we do each administration of NIES, we did include, prior to the 2019 administration, Nebraska as another state that we're hopeful when these results come out, either I would say late 2020 or early 2021, that we will be able to have Nebraska results and at least some of the grades 4 or 8 or some of the subjects reading and mathematics, and we'll continue to do so over time. I'm often asked about, you don't have California results, why? And by raw number, California has far more American Indian students than Wyoming does. But the key there is the percentage of students in a state. And I believe Wyoming is somewhere north of 3%, whereas California is definitively south of 1%. So that makes it really tricky to get at those states. Having said that, again, it's critical that we get our sample from those states across the country, including those that have very few. So in a big picture standpoint, we can provide a representative sample. And see another question, which is, can you speak about the teacher-reported variables? And I'm going to got a couple other things coming in, so I wanted to scroll up to that one. Okay, so can you speak about the teacher-reported variables and the connection to performance data, math performance, and the AIAN student-reported data, such as mathematics self-rating or self-efficacy? Can the math teachers be linked to this data?
Yeah, now Jamie is our resident expert on all things background questions, so I'll turn that part of them back over to him. But let me say that the unit of record in our analysis is the student, and the questions that are answered by the teacher and the questions that are answered by the school administrators are affixed to that record. So yes, we can tell you what the teacher how the teacher of a student responded, but the teachers are not representative necessarily of teachers in the nation, because the unit of the record is not, we don't sample for teachers, we sample for students in that way. Although we're looking at some weighting procedures that might allow us to technically report out on teachers, but not in these data that we're looking at here. So Jamie takes the other part.
Well, you really covered that very nicely, I thought. To your point, when we're reporting teacher data, we will say something like percentage of 4th and 8th grade AIA and students whose teachers agreed to, or strongly agreed, ... So that's a critical thing. You know, as far as what are we looking for, examples of school teachers that are doing well with both, I think, you know, although it's not nationally representative per se, we have a lot of teachers answering our questionnaire. And this is particularly true driven by the low density sample,
right,
where if many of our schools in the sample literally only have 1, 2, or 3, less than a handful of American Indian Alaska Native students, no matter how few students are in that sample, there's still a teacher that we issue a questionnaire to.
Yeah.
Speaking of NAEP in general, the response rates of our teachers are phenomenal. We're talking upwards of 90% response rates to our questionnaire, which we're really thankful for. And earlier this decade, we shifted our teacher and school questionnaires from a paper-based questionnaire data collection to an online questionnaire data collection. And we open up that window for completing the questionnaire 7 weeks before. It's the first Monday in December. We open up that window for completing the NIS survey questionnaire. So it's 7 weeks prior to the NIS data collection. And then we have that window extended throughout the collection of the study 1 week after that as well. Knowing that some of those in our sample don't have easy access to online, we also work closely with our data collection field staff, and if any teacher or principal needs a hard copy, we make sure they get that as well too. So that is something that gives a lot of data, a lot of power to the data, and it allows users within the NIES NDE to cut the data in different ways as long as it meets reporting standards.
So I know we got started a little late, and so we're trying to make up for that, so we are running a little later than we thought. We think we'll leave it open for a couple more questions, Jamie, if people are still asking questions, and then we'll close it down out of respect for people's time.
That sounds great. So let me read one more, and that's past research has shown strong relationships with contextual variables from the NAEP core student questionnaire with students' performance. Has there been consideration of analyzing relationships of these sorts of contextual variables with composite variables such as engagement or self-efficacy introduced in the Closer Look report or high-low density school students and their performance? And I'll let Dr. Carr begin.
Well, you know, it's a really, really good question. Those constructs that you just named are variables that we have introduced in our main NAEP report, student engagement, I think. What was it? The other one, I think, I can't remember the name of the construct, but it too, engagement or something, also included in our report. It is certainly something that could be explored in our NDE with these NIES data, because these are all on the same record. We have not considered putting them in this report, but there's no reason why they couldn't be. I think this is something we would want to talk over with Susan and her panel to see what they would think about it, but it's certainly accessible to it.
And I'm glad you're making that point too, because you'll notice that it is a hard copy, so there's only so much data we can get in those 32 pages, or the previous report, there was also 32 pages. So there's a wealth of other data that we got into in our presentation at the end. So it's something we really want to be mindful of in terms of what's the most salient, what's the most relevant. And we'll look at going forward in future reporting modules, what is it? Is it, you know, continue hard copy, because we're really concerned about accessibility, or maybe it's a mixed module where we would do a little bit online and, you know, 1, not 2 reports hard copy. And Dr. Faircloth, I welcome any additional thoughts you might have on this as well.
I think you did a nice job of answering that question, Jamie. I would want to make sure that there were two other questions, if we could just try to touch on those quickly. I know, again, we're over time, but there was a question from Dr. Redcorn, and then there was another question about past research. Is it possible, Jamie, to just touch on those really quickly?
Sure. Do you want to begin with that? We're looking at it on our side, so I welcome your comments first.
Yeah, could you read the question? I'm not able to see it. Could you read the question?
Yes, so
Okay,
Dr. Redcorn,
oh, please go ahead.
The NIES questionnaires, it just popped away. Let me see if I can get back to it. NIES questionnaires are available online. So that was a response to him. Let me go back to his question. He says, recently the state of Kansas has begun to explore ways in which we can get specific needs assessment data to open up opportunities for successful grant proposals. Since states like Kansas and Nebraska have a lower number of tribal nations and communities, they are not currently part of the data collection for NIES. How might states such as Kansas and Nebraska become part of the geographic boundaries associated with NIES data collection, or are there options for resource sharing to leverage the NIES methodological frameworks to be applied to states like Kansas and Nebraska? Angeline from OIE responded that the NIES questionnaires are available online to download. These are publicly available. A state, tribe, or school could choose to administer a subset of those questions and then compare their school-specific or state-specific results with the results that are publicly available through the NAEP Data Explorer, and that might provide some local data. Jamie or Dr. Carr, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Oh, well, I'm really supportive of that, and these questionnaires are publicly available. They're also, you know, unlike the test questions, which we keep secure so we can use in future administrations, we actually release the NIES survey questions, same as NAEP, before we even conduct assessment. So they are not copyrighted. States are free, or other individuals are free to use them verbatim. They could also modify them according to their own input as well.
Yeah, all of these are really excellent responses here to this question. The only thing I would add is that we do release items, cognitive items for reading and mathematics. And in the case of mathematics, there are literally thousands of items going back to the 90s that have been released when you consider all the grades across time. So, and we sometimes have, in the more recent years, sample responses, basic, proficient, and advanced, or how students of various subgroups might respond to those release items. So there's a way of sort of really creating a context for understanding what the students are responding to, what is the nature of the assessment, and how students are asked to provide context.
And I did want to thank just all the individuals on this WebEx too for their questions. I wish I could get through every last one of them. We will capture it on our side because I think it's something that we collectively, not just NCES, but the TRP and our partners, can consider going forward as we look at moving the NIES forward.
Yeah, and I think what we've done in the past, we can certainly do it here. We can answer any unanswered questions,
yes,
and then we can post them for all to see. We regret if we did not have a chance to read and answer your questions. We value each and every one of them.
And my name and contact information is on the back of the report as well.
Mm-hmm. And Jamie, I would also say, I mean, thank you and Dr. Carr and Hager Sharp and ETS and everyone else who helped to organize today's webinar. And to those of you who joined, I am also happy in my role as a member of the TRP, but also in my role as an independent researcher. If there's anyone on the call today who'd like to, have some conversations about possible ways to collaborate on some data analysis or future research, I'm always happy to entertain those questions. You can email me at Colorado State. If you just Google me, Susan Faircloth, at Colorado State, I'm happy to have further conversations either by phone or via email. So thank you all again. Really appreciate this opportunity.
I think we would be remiss if we terminated this call without thanking once again the Office of Indian Education for supporting this study. It would not be possible, I should reiterate, it would not be possible without their continual support and very strong leadership for this study. So thank you, Angelia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.